This is the first attempt at an EUCOR lecture cycle. One should think that we might have got that idea earlier, having been an EUCOR university since time immemorial, and definitely the English departments cooperating since 2005. That was shortly before I got my job here. And we set up this cooperation between the Albert Ludwigs Universität Freiburg, which I sometimes these days shorten to ALU. You'll see that on some other slides. The Université de Alsace in Mulhouse, the Université de Strasbourg, and Universität Basel. The Karlsruhe Institute of Technology appears in brackets here because they don't have an English department, so they can't be part of the fun. The deal for us, and actually for you, and this might be of interest for you, is that this is a program that includes student mobility. Not that there aren't tons of and quite high bureaucratic hurdles and obstacles that make things unnecessarily difficult, but I mean that's the German condition in the year of our Lord 2021 and has been for a while, and I don't really see how it's going to change much, even with a new government. But technically speaking, you can take classes at all of these universities. And there is a program online on the web pages where you can see which classes you can take. Of course, all of the universities have different semester periods, so when our semester is over, theirs start and so on, but sometimes that's even an advantage. We've had staff exchanges. 4 years I taught in Strasbourg and in Basel so far. Mulhouse was well nigh inaccessible by public transport, at least that's improving, so maybe we'll be able to do that sometime soon. The EARS is a staff event. That's an once per semester meeting of staff members and scholars exchanging notes and presenting research. But the annual master's conference, to which from 2009 an annual PhD conference was added at the same days, usually a Friday and a Saturday. That we sometimes also call the annual farm show, because there we present our produce, and our produce is you. So particularly master's theses and then PhDs. Used to be also wissenschaftliche Arbeiten, but that's been phased out. Presented in what I can only describe as a very amiable atmosphere. So if you're interested in winning your first spurs in the academic field, at a conference where you can be sure that after your presentation nobody will get up and ask you how you could possibly not look deeply into race, class, gender, and drop all sorts of names like Giorgio Agamben, and then sort of grind you underfoot, then the annual Masters Conference is your deal. As I said, it's usually very friendly. We have become friends over the years. The EUCOR PhD Award is something that happens every 5 years. So one last year we missed out on, so it's this year again. And if you're planning on having your PhD done by 2026, you might be the next one. And the Stephen Crane Awards are awarded biannually for the best final thesis. This may be a BA, a master, or a PhD that we've had in North American studies over the past 2 years. So this is not just English department, this may be history, pol sci, ethnology, whoever writes something on North American studies. And that's going to happen on Monday, this coming Monday, November 1st, in Badenweiler from 4 p.m. if you're interested in it. It's going to be the first time that all 4 universities participate. We had hogged the Stephen Crane Award since 2007, when the mayor of Badenweiler and myself initiated this thing, but now we are going to extend this to a EUCOR thing. And this is also the reason, long story, why this is a lecture on Stephen Crane's times. Because on Monday, we also celebrate the 150th anniversary of Stephen Crane's birth in Newark, New Jersey. And he died, and this is the thing that makes him a local boy, in Badenweiler in the then Grand Duchy of Baden in 1900. On 5th June, we celebrate the birthday rather than the day of his untimely demise at the age of only 28, simply because it's more fun to celebrate birthdays, one, and two, in the summer, there's a lot going on in Badenweiler anyway, but 1st of November, they figured they could need a boost, and so we have this extra thing that happens every 2 years. Then, in the even years usually, and in the odd years, we used to furbish actually the other way around. In the odd years, we have the award. In the even years, we furbish a lecture on a Stephen Crane-related theme. Again, around November 1st, normally on a Sunday. Why are we particularly proud of Stephen Crane? I mean, weren't there other people that passed through here? We know that Hemingway, for instance, did. In the summer of 1922, Ernest Hemingway apparently stood with his back on the Freiburg Münster and wrote about the people on the farmer's market and about a hat shop, Tritschler, where he bought himself a hat, which shows up on himself in photographs of Hemingway for the next 10 years before it becomes a complete wreck and seems to have been discarded. But Hemingway didn't like Freiburg particularly, or the Germans. For that matter, Stephen Crane didn't either. But having somebody die on your doorstep seems to be a somewhat greater thing than just somebody passing through and making some ugly remarks on the people and the place. So we settled for him as a writer. Henry James and Mark Twain were, as a matter of fact, in Baden-Baden, and I tried to establish contacts with them at some point, but Baden-Baden seems to be a very rich place, and besides, they bank more on their Russian connections. There are also always a lot of Russians in Baden-Baden and decidedly less Americans. So, yeah, that was another reason why we stayed with Crane, about whom Hemingway said famously that the good writers are Henry James, Stephen Crane, and Mark Twain. You know, two of them Baden-Baden, ours here in Badenweiler. That's not the order they're good in. There's no order for good writers, if you believe that. We'll hear more about what Hemingway had to say then, right after this, about Mark Twain and notably Huckleberry Finn, when I do the lecture in this lecture cycle on Huckleberry Finn. Crane is mostly known these days among students, even if you haven't heard the name before or anything else, for a war novel called The Red Badge of Courage. And ironically, this novel, The Red Badge of Courage, sort of by several odd connections, has another person and another place in the vicinity that is related to it, because there is a film version of The Red Badge of Courage, directed in 1952 by the famous Howard Hawks. And the main character, the youth, as Crane only calls him in that book, Henry Fleming, is performed by a young man by the name of Audie Murphy. Now, Audie Murphy happened to be also the most highly decorated American soldier of World War II. And not only was he that, but he won his Medal of Honor in Holzwihr. How many of you are familiar with the Elsass and places there? Yeah. Holzwihr is?
I come from Elsass, but there are a lot of villages like that.
Northeast of Colmar. Mm-hmm. Where he, I think you can see this just a bit here, stood on an already burning tank that had been hit by German tank fire, and with the anti-aerial machine gun fired at advancing German infantry, that way giving his beaten company the chance to retreat. So there's a monument there for Audie Murphy, which relates through the Red Badge of Courage to Stephen Crane and Badenweiler, but, and we could have chosen Audie Murphy, of course, as a namesake for our awards here, but Audie Murphy played in not just the Red Badge of Courage, but in a lot of really silly and stupid westerns, like The Guns of Fort Petticoat. I spare you the details about these movies. Safe to say, he's not really that great a person to call a literary award after, so we stayed with Stephen Crane. And this is the place in Badenweiler, in Badstraße. Kind of weird having to explain to Americans that this does not mean Bad Street. You know, this is actually Bath. But it had another name when Crane died there in 1900. There's the monument in front that was put there in 1990. So Stephen Crane and Stephen Crane's Times. Why Stephen Crane's Times? Because only 28 years of his life, but give or take a few at the front end and at the back end, and you have the American Civil War and the First World War into that, and you have a period in American history and American economy, American political life that is characterized by massive industrialization. But generally, these three terms that I have at the top here: technologization, convergence, and transformation. So transforming from a largely rural and largely farming middle-class society to an industrial society with a lot of people being constantly endangered by pauperization, and an aspiring middle class that tries to get rich as fast as they can. So we get in these years labor wars that are the most brutal and the most costly in terms of money, but also human lives in the Western world. Nowhere else are the labor wars as bitterly fought over as in the United States, with sometimes the army and paramilitary organizations like the so-called Pinkertons deployed against striking workers. You get a massive wave of immigration in the 1880s in particular. Colonization of the West and of those parts of the country that have not been settled yet, at the expense, of course, of the indigenous population. And the the chance that American democracy had in the 18th century, where it was a system built on meritocracy, built on the idea of those who could serve their country best, taking offices and taking jobs in the public administration. From there, well, it had already taken some steps down from there during the Jacksonian period, for instance, and in the 1850s. But the subsumption of the Republican democracy under economic liberalism, that's a phenomenon also of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And this means that Stephen Crane becomes a witness to the incipient modernism. So industrial and technological modernization on all levels. Modernity as the cultural consciousness of this process happening, and he's one of those that in whose writings you can actually trace that. And then the modern as the cultural practice of these new formats, the attempt at radical breaks away from received forms. And Crane is not the man to perform these radical breaks, but as I will try to point out, and so will some of my colleagues during the course of this lecture series, you can see in him that most of his works, and particularly the ones that became well known, are written in a form so that they both conform to the traditional received forms. They could be read as a traditional novel, but depending on your viewpoint, whether you'd already made this step towards the cultural consciousness of being in the modern period, you could also read them from an innovative point of view. You could see the new that was happening in these texts. As I said, I'll go into more detail later. This is the timeline that we're dealing with. As I said, the Civil War and the so-called Reconstruction period, meaning that just about everything that the Civil War had achieved, particularly in terms of freedom rights and democratic rights for the African American population, was turned back well, some of it actively destroyed. I can't call it anything else. Anything but chattel slavery. Now, by 1876, the economic losses that the slaveholding society had incurred with the liberation of the slaves who were worth money. Well, cynically speaking, this was a lot of investment that went poof, up the fluke. So, but that had been paid for, that had been marked in the books. And from, again, a cynical point of view, peonage, tenant farming, is cheaper than working with slaves, because you don't have to feed those people, you don't have to take care of them when they're sick, you don't have to worry about them if they're close to dying. I mean, here's your investment. If they did, you hired somebody else. As easy as that. There is a massive economic depression in the 1970s, to which the American society and most of its industrialists respond by cutting workers' wages, and there you see already where some of those labor wars come from. Okay, Crane is too young for that. The Centennial Exhibition of 1876, he was 5 years old, so this is not something he would have seen. And the Tilden-Hayes Compromise, which installed this Reconstruction, or ended the Reconstruction period and basically reinstalled the old elites in the South. That's something he did not write about. They call this the Gilded Age, 1870 and 1880s. So, not golden. What's the difference between golden and gilded? Gilded is fake. That's
But it's not completely gold.
That's it. I repeat this for those who couldn't hear that. It has a layering of gold. Sometimes it's even painted on just to look like it's gold. That would be fake. But if you scrape a little bit on the surface underneath, you'll find there's just rusty metal. So this is basically what it is. A lot of people make a lot of money, and the majority doesn't. And this kind of economic system is characterized by repeated bull periods and then bust periods, bear periods again. You know, the market turns into a huge bubble. At the moment, for instance, we're looking at a increasing bubble in real estate, and then at some point the bottom drops out of that market and everybody runs to get their money out of it, and the stock market panics then result in disaster, out of which people again can make money. I don't go into the economic details. And then the cycle begins anew. And the period ends with the Spanish-American War and then the First World War, which the US entered somewhat reluctantly only in 1917. If we want a symbol for the period, it would be this one here, I guess, the Statue of Liberty erected in 1886, already at the Centennial Exhibition. The flame, the torch, with the hand was shown there, and you see Bartholdi, the man who designed it, an initial build of it to make sure that all the parts were there in the port of Le Havre in the middle, and then on the right that's her as she stands in New York. Typical for a Gilded Age insofar as the design, technically speaking, technologically speaking, is highly innovative. Now, you could not build a structure like this before Bartholdi designed it like that. But then the outward design with this Roman toga is hopelessly anachronistic. This is not modern. And this is exactly one of those moments where you can see the tectonic plates sort of rubbing against each other in American culture. And again, there's a relation to us and around here. Have you ever been to North Colmar? Yeah, no? There she stands. Somewhat diminished in size, but 2 years ago I taught a class called the Anglo-American Upper Rhine, and we went on the traces of all of these people and all of these places, and that was one of the sites. This class of mine that you can see the students here and I visited. Back to Stephen Crane, who is probably not the kid on this photograph. It's one that you find on the internet saying this is Stephen Crane in his youth. I doubt that. Now this is an absolute specialist question. Why? Anybody here specialist in the history of photography? Apparently not. This is clearly a snapshot picture. Now somebody taking that with a camera, out of hand click. That's a design, that's a technology that was developed only in the late 1880s. Crane was born in 1871. This kid here is younger than he would have been at the time when this technology became available. So that it's a circumstantial argumentation. We know, however, that the person on the left, that's his mother. And this is the house that they lived in. Not quite from the start, but a bit later. He was the 14th child, the last one. The mother might have been grateful. and the ninth one to survive, of Jonathan Townley Crane, who was a minister with the Methodist Episcopal Church, and Mary Helen Peck Crane, who seems to have been more the driving force in and behind the family. His father died when he was 8, and then his mother moved into this house here in Asbury Park. What's now called the Stephen Crane House was never as much his as it was actually his mother's. The community there, having been founded in the 1870s by a New York-based industrialist by the name of James Bradley, and he had founded this whole settlement as a sort of refuge, a religious group settling there together, modeled on another Methodist settlement in the vicinity called Ocean Grove. So this was supposed to be a pious and quiet place of spiritual well-being and religious reflection. Mrs. Crane called this house the Arbutus Cottage, after the flowering ground cover that you find in the area, which is also known as the Mayflower. By the way, the Cranes go back not quite to the Mayflower, but 1639 they were already in North America. So this is a rather religious, a long established family there, and one that would place their religious denomination over a lot of other possible concerns, even moving to one of these secluded places. Crane was raised mostly by his sister Agnes, who was 15 years older than he was, and who was a school teacher. And she died at 28, just like he did later on. The Crane children, all of them, don't seem to have been particularly healthy. And Stephen died already several times before he then finally did, already as a kid. Taught himself to read at age 4, but his schooling remained rather sketchy. This is a photograph of him, the earliest one that's certifiably him, as a cadet, military cadet at Claverack College, which was a sort of partly military private school. By this time, he's already being farmed out to a variety of schools because he never stays anywhere particularly long, tends to get kicked out. He also has started writing. Already at age 16, he writes short reports and sketches for the local newspaper. And this is another thing that the 1880s and 90s are sort of egregious in, and that is the rise of journalism. Just about everybody seems to be founding newspapers or writing for newspapers. Something that starts already before the Civil War and is enhanced by the Civil War and continues into the 20th century. So, Crane, as I said, getting kicked out of, in sequence, Pennington Seminary near Trenton, Claverack on the Hudson, Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, but finally he actually makes it to Syracuse University, where you can see him here in the front row in the middle. He's not the coach, he's the captain of the freshman baseball team. So sports at that time are taking a hike in popularity, particularly at schools and university. One of the strange things about sports, I teach a class on sports this semester, and one of the first things we established is sports in the US is a school and university thing. I myself worked for a semester in 2012 at the University of Oregon, Eugene, which felt like working for a sports club with an attached education department. And Americans arriving here and wanting to know about our sports system are usually flabbergasted by the fact that we don't have any. I mean, is there a university football team? I wouldn't know it. We saw the Pumas yesterday, the lacrosse team. If you're looking for a team to play with, the lacrosse team is looking for students, particularly the women's team. Most of the players there that we saw there yesterday seem to be first semesters who joined just now. So this is a team that's forming from scratch. Always a good moment to join a team. So he was good at sports, definitely. He was bad at just about everything else, but mostly lazy. Yeah. So with these years now from Crane's life, we get an idea of the things going on in American society and those that he participated in and those that he didn't. So American society in the 1880s, we see improving healthcare. As I said, 5 of his siblings had already died by the time Crane was born. He pulled through. They managed to get him through a double pneumonia at age 2. And my hat's off to that, because that's something I survived at age 2, and it wasn't fun, as far as I can remember. There is the continuing importance of religious denomination, and the Americans, rather than any other country in the Western world, are still very much a society to this day where religion plays a strong role. And particularly this white Christian nationalism that has decided to side with the former president. Industrialization and the labor wars are something that he is spared direct contact with, and they do not play a large role in his writing later on. But we can see where, with this place, Asbury Park, where he moves, the societal utopianism that had been very strong in US society in the first half of the 19th century, with all sorts of utopian communities going up here, there, and there. Nathaniel Hawthorne, for a while, is a member, a paid-up, card-carrying member of one of those utopian societies, and he writes a novel about it, not The Scarlet Letter, it's called The Blithedale Romance. It's not really a really good novel, actually. It's pretty boring. But some of the things he writes about this society and how they operate and how there are sort of leader figures and half sort of gurus, that tells you a lot about it. But this societal utopianism of the first half of the 19th century is now giving way to these people sort of withdrawing, forming their own little groups at the edge, fringe of society, financially and racially withdrawing behind what's not quite gated communities yet, but this is where those gated communities in contemporary American society come from. And why they have them, why they don't even think about having something like that. We get an idea of the school system. School is there, does exist, but is apparently not compulsory. Crane manages to cram the contents of 2 years' worth of schooling, elementary school years, into 6 weeks, and then just enters the next grade. Which also gives you an idea of the American school system being what it was and in a way still is. I remember my son, who was a 4th grader, didn't speak a lot of English, actually hardly any, getting into that school in Eugene. And the only thing that he needed to figure out was that Times wasn't referring to the newspaper or to something on the clock, but meant 6 times 3 is 18. Once he got that Times, he realized that they were about a year behind what he had done already in his German elementary school, and from there on he spread shock and awe in this class because he could do all these things already, and he enjoyed that enormously. It was the only time in his school life that he could do that. Our daughter is a different story. school system. And there's a literary scene in which Crane starts participating early on. A mainstream scene, of course, and then at the same time, there are two strong movements that shape what Crane would do later on. One, the so-called School of Literary Realism, which accounts for only about 10% of the literature of the period. You know, when you'll hear about literary realism 1870 to 1910, it sounds as if that's all there ever was. But no, it's just one school, and in their time, they are sort of the dissident fringe on the margin of that mainstream. And crisscrossing the mainstream and the margins is a strong element of satire. That is a fact that you get a lot of in US culture of the time, of the period. So, literary scenes, and I explain some things here in a bit more detail. Or rather, I point ahead at some of the things that will happen in this class. For instance, part of the literary mainstream is a surge in melodrama. And melodrama, as it's sometimes also called, is something that grows from the French origins in the late 18th century and the British and American examples in the early 19th, with a lot of action and a lot of wilderness scenes and crocodiles and tigers and so on. It grows into a technological feat, just as an appetizer for what I and this woman over there, do you recognize yourself? Yeah. Damaris Stein will tell you more about on December 9th. Just an appetizer, this grows from a train on the stage being a cardboard and canvas contraption that's being carried across the stage by two people making puffing noises, and then it falls apart halfway across, to a makeshift theater built near the roundhouse of the town, and in the respective scene with rails through the theater, and in the respective scene you fold back the wings and you have a whole train running that way through the theater, and then another train coming this way through the theater, and they're throwing a mailbag from one train to the other. And this is the age of coal fire, eh? So the whole place must have been filled with smoke and embers, and I don't know if they had a roof on it. It's pretty insane. We're still trying to find out more about this because obviously the plays weren't particularly good, and there are no recordings of any of this stuff. So there's preciously little material that you find about this. So that's going to come. Also, a lot of the literature of the time is actually written by women. Actually, the vast majority of it is written by women. And you may wonder, why are the names that have been dropped here so far, starting with Stephen Crane himself, and then Henry James, and Mark Twain, and William Dean Howells, and all of them are males. Most of these women wrote for magazines, and because they had to finance themselves and their families, they wrote rather mainstream stuff, which fell by the wayside in the long run. There's some stuff to be rediscovered here, and there are, of course, writers that are more well-known, like Sarah Orne Jewett, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who are worth keeping and rediscovering. A really genial writer like Charlotte Perkins Gilman wasn't rediscovered until the 1960s. And her utopian novel, Herland, from 1915, was only published in serialized form originally. So there wasn't a edition as a novel until the 1970s. So this is something that Sami Ludwig from Universität de Alsace will talk to us about. Yep, Sami, can you hear me? I hope he's there. I have no idea yet how we will do that, but I hope you'll be able to see him as a motion picture up here. Worst case scenario, we'll all have to go and look into our respective machines, and we'll do this thing on Zoom. But we can still meet here, obviously. Satire is going to be the job of our own Christoph Haas here, whom some of you may know from the Department of Political Science. I don't think he's listening, but anyway, you can see from this example that I picked here, Thomas Nast, who was the most famous satirist of this period, German immigrant, did never portray Crane, unfortunately. I searched through all that stuff, and Crane doesn't show up there. He didn't depict any literary people, in fact. Apparently didn't take them too seriously. But one of his favorite targets was the New York tycoon that he depicts here, so-called Boss Tweed. So there's something about New York businessmen that seems to invite graft, corruption, and the idea that you get away with just about everything but murder. In fact, the New York tycoon who unfortunately happened to be the ex-president of the United States claimed that he could get away with murder if he wanted to. I hope he gets away with being the ex-president of the United States, and as far as I'm concerned, that's the last anybody needs to ever hear of him. But here, can you read this text where it says, in counting there is strength, and it says, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? No, which is what, if I understand him correctly, was exactly what this man had in mind last year and this year. And I don't even mind if he keeps thinking that he's the president of the United States for the duration. I've met another person who thought he was the president of the United States. But anyway, we're not talking about that. This is just a side effect. But again, something that tells you, why do Americans, in fact, not all rise up and rebel against these conditions? Because they've had them before. Because it's a long history of graft and corruption. Because the land of unlimited opportunities and possibilities meant largely graft and corruption for a lot of people for a long time. They're not nearly as democratic and as Republican as they think. And this is one of the periods in which and from which this can be shown. And also where the literature, at least some of it, tried to do something about these situations and this whole condition. Literary realism, for instance. Not all literary realism is as harmless as Henry James. What is literary realism? Literary realism is and firstly, that which goes beyond the romantic and starts basing its forms and its characterizations and situational depictions on the observable rather than the imaginable, on the factoid, on actual places, on at least possible events, if not actual events that they had seen and they then wrote about. There are two backgrounds to this. One is observations on working class life. First, by this woman here, whose book on the mill workers in the place where she grew up in, where was that again? I think Worcester, New York. Life in the Iron Mills, a story published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1861. That's often these days cited as the starting point of American literary realism. So coincides with the American Civil War, but didn't really have anything to do with the Civil War in and by itself. By the way, she was the mother of Richard Harding Davis, the adventure novelist and journalist that Crane also met later in the time when he was covering the Greco-Turkish War of 1897. The other background is the actual experience of the Civil War. There was preciously little about the Civil War that was romantic or could possibly be romanticized. And one of the first authors, if not the first author, who tried to capture this into written form was this gentleman here, John William DeForest, who served as a captain with the 12th Connecticut Infantry, was wounded in the war, and the book is absolutely hopeless. There is this Baroque title, Miss Ravenel's Conversion from Secession to Loyalty. It was published in 1867. They didn't do good proofreading, so the thing is brimming with typos and mistakes. There are even sort of half pages missing. It's a publisher's disaster to begin with. And then he tries to capture this war experience. And you think, good God, does he do a bad job of it? Because there's this completely burlesque scene where a handful of Union soldiers and a bunch of convalescent soldiers, so wounded and sick men who are just recovering, and a bunch of escaped slaves who have made it into this fort, a total of maybe 100 men, plus Dr. Ravenel himself, who is completely incapable of distinguishing the front end of a gun from the rear end. They defend this fort against a whole brigade of Confederate infantry that are trying to get at them, but make a very stupid strategic mistake and end up lying in the mud face down in front of the fort and can't move because the other guys got them covered. And it ends with these soldiers, after about 12 hours without food and drink, finally coming up with a little white flag and saying, can we'd like to give up, this is too much. And so these 100 idiots end up capturing 700 Confederate infantrymen, whom they can't deal with, so they tell them to throw their guns into the river and sit on that stretch of land by the river in front of the fort so they can still keep them covered until reinforcements arrive. You think this is burlesque, this is completely stupid. I did my habilitation on the literature of the American Civil War. I found the official report. This is completely factual from the first moment to the last. So what's realism? This is so idiotic that if there had been proper editorship, they would have probably deleted it, saying this is improbable, impossible, and implausible. Yeah, but that's how it happened. Can you imagine how the experience of the war sometimes is stranger than any potential fiction? That's one of the problems of realism. That's why we have such a thing as postmodern literature, where you get away with something like that. And this is exactly, I can't prove whether Crane knew this book, but the struggle that John William DeForest fought with realism is remarkable. It's also remarkable because there was a commentary, there was a review that said DeForest's battle descriptions were so perfectly natural and perfectly authentic and really great, and that came from Henry James, who had never seen a battle. His two brothers, Forrest and Robertson, did. They were officers in the 54th Massachusetts, that black regiment, the first one, Colonel Robert Goldshaw. You may have seen the film Glory, movie Glory, no? Matthew Broderick as Robert Goldshaw. He really looks like Robert Goldshaw, isn't it? Denzel Washington is in it, Morgan Freeman is in it. It's a film, it's actually really tacky, but in a way it's still worth watching. The music is terrible. Anyway, back to here. Look at these chaps. This is another author of the American Civil War. The guy on the left, that's him, Albion Turgey. What do you see here in this picture? I'd be interested in your reactions. Who are these people? Left-handed people are supposed to have a good imagination. Tell me what you see. No? No.
Three men were worn out, so probably ex-soldiers, refugees.
Ex-soldiers, worn out stuff, ex-soldiers. Okay, that's a good one. I can work with that. No, these are people on active service. These are three officers, the regimental adjutant in the middle, that was a major, and two first lieutenants of the 105th Ohio Infantry. They're carrying their sabers. That's the only thing that indicates these are officers. They have reduced their shoulder pieces to little strips here. If you enlarge this a bit, if you look closely, you can see that the guy on the left, that is Albion Turgey, the far left, has this little discoloring here, right? That's the first lieutenant's stripe. Why did they reduce them to that? Why do they not wear the double-breasted frock coats that they would be entitled to? Because guns in the Civil War carried 400 yards. And the Confederate sharpshooter would possibly pick off an officer before they would shoot at a man. So a good idea about being in the Civil War as an officer was to make yourself as invisible as you could, which is what they achieved by wearing this stuff. They look like three hobos waiting for a train. But no, this is what officers really looked like in the field. It's one of the few pictures where they did not doll themselves. Picture taken here. Yes, sir, like this chap. That's another first lieutenant, but you can see button up, frock coat. Jawohl, this is for the pictures being taken in a official situation. This is Ambrose Bierce, who also wrote about the Civil War, and around the time that Crane was writing, and Bierce he definitely knew, but Bierce's writing, pained as it was, in a lot of places and times still smacks of Edgar Allan Poe, of the Romantic period. He works a lot with these ideas of terror, fright, and what that can do to a person. In an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, for instance, where a Confederate spy and bridge burner is hanged by Union forces, the split second between the moment when he drops on the rope and his neck snaps and he dies is extended into a whole day and a half that he imagines his escape, swimming down the river, running across the fields, going back home, and the moment he's reaching his wife and tries to embrace her, game over. Which, however, was Bierce's commentary on electrocution, which was claimed to be a more humane form of killing somebody than other forms. where he said, do the relativity of time. Albert Einstein had not come up yet with his relativity theory, but they were already discussing that. How long can a split second be depending on how and where and when you experience it? It's one of the most terrible stories to come out of the Civil War. And by a man who had some of the most terrible experiences, including a shot in the head, which leveled him out for a while. And he wrote a story about that, about a man who's been shot in the head and who decades after the war then finds himself suddenly in the presence of a monument to the brigade that he fought in and goes completely crazy. Which is what basically happened to Beers. He had been a journalist, of course, like everybody else, and then he got an invitation to a reunion with his former brigade, 20 years after. He does not go, but then he starts writing. And the writing, I would say, clearly indicates that the man was suffering from a very bad case of post-traumatic stress disorder. And in 1913, he disappears in Mexico, basically, I think, looking for a bullet to kill him. So the Mexican Civil War, which had been going on for a while between the Villadas and the Zapatistas and the government. So, these are not popular authors. So Beers is more a popular author than Albion Turgey is. Turgey is a satirist. Beers, as a popular author, he writes what people think. And somebody once said, a popular author writes what people think, genius invites them to think something else. In that respect, Crane would be more of a genius, at least at times, and Beers more a popular author. Crane knew the war only from stories, from histories, and from photographs like this one. In The Red Badge of Courage, he describes a scene with dead soldiers that they're passing, and it's exactly those dead. You can tell that he's looking at the photograph as he's writing where and how these people are distributed there on the field. So this is where we then get to literary realism, naturalism, and the modern, including Stephen Crane. Do you guys need a break? Should we have a five-minute break to water up or down? I usually have a 5-minute break during my lectures, but we didn't do that with the recordings in it, and most people are shaking their heads. So, yeah, you up there on the who are only watching this on the camera, you can of course now go and do something else, because you know this will all be recorded and you can look at it again anytime you want. Now those people who are in the room are stuck. So, real and the realistic. What is real? What is realistic? Students often tell me that something is realistic, which normally means that based on their life experience, that is TV, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and so on, they consider it that likely, or at least feasible. That's a problem, because more for today, or from today's point of view, I find that maybe you excluded, but a lot of students that I talk to don't seem to have any real life experiences. Most of their knowledge and most of what they do and the interactions also take place on social media or in games that they play. My son was a bit like that, and he had a rather healthy dose of the real recently when beginning of April he joined the German military, and they deployed him with the Rangers in Bischofswiesen, Gebirgsjäger. And the next 2.5 months were the most realistic phase of his life so far, with real mud, real cold, real wet, real hunger, real thirst. Everything was a lot more real than it had been before. Literary realism is immediately connected to another movement parallel at the same time, what we refer to as scientific positivism. So in a way, the literary realists try to side up with these science people who are finding out all these factualities about technology, about biology, about geography, geology, the universe. I said earlier, relativity theory, Albert Einstein, the groundwork for that was laid then. The objectifiably factual. Now, this is a time period when universities are not exactly expanding. There are not that many new universities being founded or so, but they are taken more seriously. There's more interest in what they have to say, what they deliver. And there is this literary utopianism, not so much utopian societies any longer or foundations of little villages and groups moving there, but more an idealist thing, notably in the wake of Edward Bellamy's looking backward, a utopian view back from the year 2000 to 1887. And in the year 2000, if he had been right, this place, for instance, would have looked like the city designs that you saw with the political program years back of a party. Was was denn diese yogischen Flieger? Wie hieß die Partei nochmal? Habe mich darauf verlassen, dass ich mich daran erinnern kann, wenn ich es brauche. Es war nicht die Partei bibeltreuer Christen, aber one of those wacko splinter groups on the esoteric left. This is basically what Bellamy was advocating too. It took them about 20 years of Bellamy societies all over the North America until they realized that this was hopelessly unrealistic, that they were not going to get anywhere with it. And in fact, that there was a rigidity and a moment of being forced to do things that didn't agree with American ideals at all. So programmatic realism, as in literary realism, is largely connected with the names of Henry James and William Dean Howells, both of whom were friends of Stephen Crane and even admirers to an extent, and certainly sponsors. The idea behind this is that you describe true feelings, so nothing romantically exaggerated. Love is not something that happens as in Romeo and Juliet, where, of course, there's also an economy of the dramatic action. But it may be something that people grow in. Love is, for instance, something that people grow into rather than that has them smitten from the moment they meet. Grids of events and figures that show likely, possibly also desirable conditions. The realists, or at least Henry James, opted for an absence of a political agenda. Howells was more disposed towards trying to do something about political conditions. We'll hear more about that. And local color, meaning other than before, local dialects, local customs, folklore, and so on are not comicalized any longer from a middle-class point of view, but are described in as close detail as possible. Now, this is Howells as a younger man. He had won his first literary spurs by writing a campaign biography for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And in the usual form in which you get rewarded for services rendered to a successful political candidate, he becomes the US consul in, of all places, Venice. Later on, he is the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, and that is one, of course, of the most important magazines in US cultural history to this day. Not for this magazine, but for the Century, which comes up in around 1875, if I remember correctly. He writes an important and famous article defending the art of Henry James. That is a sort of program, that's why I call this programmatic realism, because these two write about each other's writings, and this is as close to a poetology of realist writing as we get. And then he switches from the Atlantic Monthly to Harper's New Monthly magazine, and there he is sort of the guru of American letters for many years. You know, if he points his thumbs up for an author, that author rises. It's sort of Marcel Reich-Ranitzky. Do you remember who that was? Is that still a household name? I never liked Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, to be honest, but there are these guru figures in just about every literary culture and at all times. Often they are writers who themselves never quite make it to the absolute top level. But they know everybody, they know everything, they're at one of those pivot points in a cultural situation, and they can pull the strings. That's William Dean Howells for you. And we'll hear more about William Dean Howells again from Sami Ludwig, who in fact will therewith contribute more to this lecture series than anybody else, including my own dear colleagues who left me completely alone with this thing, all of them. And I'm looking forward to the next meeting of the directorate of this seminar, where I will give them my opinion about that. I'm getting old enough to enjoy these things. And here's Henry James. As a kid, there were photographs of children. It's not as if it would have been impossible to take one of Stephen Crane, but this, as you can see, is not quite the same technology as the one above. This is a so-called Ambrotype, for which you don't see that, you had a clasp in the back of your head, and you stood there for 12 seconds and you were not supposed to move. Actually, those soldiers, the three bums, probably stood there like that for 12 seconds too, but they look far more leisurely, right? That's why you don't see a lot of people laugh on pictures from that period. No, try to laugh for 12 seconds when you're standing there with something in your neck. No, that's not that much fun. And ambrotypes are one of a kind. And of course, this is a painting of him as he becomes the grand seigneur of American letters, the most famous grand poobah of the High Macamacs. More on Henry James, and especially the French realist school, from Mary Boynton, who is the head of the Syracuse University abroad program in Strasbourg. Isn't that fun? I mean, the person we get to do this on Henry James is actually a professor at the university that Crane attended. And she's going to come here from Strasbourg. She wants to do this in person. Calling Henry James a realist, this is anticipating a little bit what she might be saying, has one serious drawback, and that is the fact that he himself wrote a short story, which is the one text by Henry James I usually teach in classes, called The Real Thing. And in that story, you have a young artist trying to find sitters for paintings. That's why I had the painting of Henry James here, because that makes the most money. But if he can't have sitters for paintings, he will settle for illustrating stories, illustrating books. Doesn't pay nearly as much, but at least it pays the bills. So illustrations like this one. The problem is you need models for that. And there are two people that offer themselves to him, Major and Mrs. Monarch. First, he thinks they are going to be sitters because they look impeccably dressed, absolutely stylish. Very ordinary British people, thank you. But they want to be models because they've speculated with their money, and one of those economy crashes, stock market crashes, they've lost everything. But their style and their attitude and their pose. So he takes them on, but finds after a rather short period that he can't work with them because all they ever look is like Major and Mrs. Monarch. With a name like that, you know, Monarch. They're as British as it gets. They are the real thing. But they are so real, the real thing, that there isn't any sort of maneuver space around them. And he ends up working with an uncouth, half-illiterate, half-stupid Irish servant girl named Mrs. Cherm and a Italian immigrant waiter who doesn't speak English and sort of waits on people in the corner pub by the name of Oronte. But these two can, when he tells them what to do and shows them what to do, they can take on any pose and any impression and anything he wants. And in fact, in the last scene of the book, Mrs. Monarch, seeing the Cherm girl, walks up to her and rearranges her hair just a bit so that this illustrator goes, yeah, that's it. Huh? This is exactly it. So she can do things outside of the box, only that they've always, this traditional old society has boxed itself in, effectively. They are Major and Mrs. Monarch, thank you, nothing else. Whereas in order to be able to catch the real, you have to have imagination. And you need models, and you need a model situation that spurs the imagination. So ultimately, and this is halfway through his, I think 1892 is the publication date, you find that in literature, scientific positivism just doesn't work. There has to be something beyond that. There has to be a moment of the fantastic, a moment of the imaginative, a moment of the performative. It's the performativity of these two that cooperates with the art of the illustrator. Now, art is ultimately not scientific, definitely not as scientific as these guys here were. Well, in philosophy, utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill. In the natural sciences, and notably in biology, you find that Charles Darwin is making quite a splash at the time with his idea of the origin of the species. But then this survival of the fittest that American industrial society and American finance society eagerly laps up and uses immediately to their advantage, that's not Darwin. It's usually credited to Darwin, but it isn't. It's actually Thomas Henry Huxley and even more so his associate Herbert Spencer. Evidence as to man's place in nature. So not exactly any longer the crown of creation, but the one with the biggest tools, this is basically the ideology that got us where we are now, where we realize that we've destroyed most of the environment already, and if we don't start turning the wheel really fast and drastically within the next few years, we're going to destroy the rest. I mean, I remember back in the late 1980s, yeah, we were already there. There was the Nordwijk Agreement that could have been signed by most of the important industrial nations. It was the security advisor to George Bush the Elder, a man by the name of John Sununu, may his name live on in infamy, who managed to break up this agreement and managed to not have that being signed by the United States and then subsequently by everybody else. We've known that we are destroying the very ground under our feet for the past 50 years. And doesn't particularly help that most of those 50 years I've tried to fight this, but obviously not very effectively. So these are the guys, well, if you want to quote them for what they've done, who claimed that there was quality before equality. Remember the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal? No, this is the ideology that quality shows in this survival of the fittest, that everybody else who falls by the wayside, it's actually their own fault. Prepared for by the Calvinist religious group, the Puritans, also the idea that God loves you if you're economically successful, and if you're not economically successful, there's also something religiously wrong with you. They will be proven grievously wrong in the First World War, both by the trench warfare, because the war spared the unfit, and spared the shirkers, and spared the cowards who stayed at home, and killed the fit people, and killed the young ones, and killed a whole generation that would have done good to humanity. And the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu is as fitting with the First World War as any pandemic could possibly have been, insofar as that pandemic killed the young, killed the fit, killed the strong, killed the powerful, killed those whose immune systems overreacted to the virus. Quite different from the pandemic that we're still dealing with here, where most of the people that have died so far are the old ones, are the invalids, are the ones with other illnesses and diseases that they had before. And knowing that doesn't particularly doesn't make it any better. I've lost a few friends already. When you're getting that age, tough luck. I said earlier that this is a media age. This is the time when journalism takes a massive upgrading also on the reception side. And this is not just because there are more newspapers. In fact, a lot of newspapers fold up, those that had been there before the Civil War, but there are new media formations resulting from this positivist realism. Newspapers until the 1880s had largely been partisan, so owned even by one or the other party in the political system. And now you get investigative journalism. Investigative journalism and actual truth news in US history are not a very, do not have a very long tradition. You know, fake news is something that they're also used to, a lot more than what we would condone with. So this investigative journalist that results in the foundation of notably these three new newspapers. Joseph Pulitzer's The New York World, and yes, that's the one with the Pulitzer Prize. A Hungarian immigrant who was about this tall and had served with the Union cavalry in the last year of the war before he went on to work as all sorts of things and then founded his own newspaper. William Randolph Hearst in the middle, the New York Journal, and the New York Times is founded by a German immigrant by the name of Adolf Ochs. And for these people, these guys here work. Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell single-handedly brings down the Standard Oil conglomerate and leads to that being split up. It's on a par with if there was a journalist who managed to bring down Zuckerberg and his whole empire these days. I'm hoping and waiting for that. So this is Ida Tarbell. Her name should be, I should have spelled her double the size and in gilded letters. Lincoln Steffens and Ray Stannard Baker, these descending here, are two others that are like that, investigative journalists who become so popular that the big business conglomerates and people like Boss Tweed cannot afford to have them killed. A number of other journalists like that go the same way that journalists these days go in Putin's Russia, Erdogan's Turkey, and other places in the world. They get killed. Another important man, Jacob Ries, a Danish immigrant who publishes How the Other Half Lives, studies among the tenements of New York. Again, realism, in fact, naturalism, insofar as he does not end his investigation at the borderlines of middle class, but goes beyond that, goes beneath that, goes to the absolutely destitute out there in the streets. But the first edition of this book is a dud, stays on the bookshelves, because he's still working with illustrations, with drawings. The drawings are made after photographs, but that doesn't help. So the new technology of half-tone photo engraving, which from the mid-80s onwards makes it possible to reproduce photographs on newspaper material. That's revolutionary. That creates a whole new set of possibilities, makes reproducing photographs a lot cheaper. You could do that before, but it was hell of an expense. So now these photographs of what it looks like if a family has already bartered off most of their furniture and they sleep on the blank floor in the tenement rooms that they inhabit. Now they get into that book and boom, quite an echo. Crane definitely knew this book. Crane moved to New York in order to see this live. And that way he becomes, he gets close at least to what's called naturalism in American letters. Sometimes referred to as verism, but that's not verum, Wahrheit, but Eugene Ver, a French social realist. Social realism, that would be the two British authors, George Gissing and Kingsley. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The French naturalist school follows more Émile Zola, and their target is biological determinism, which you also find in the writings of Frank Norris, who's usually mentioned first when somebody says American naturalism. The idea that, okay, so if you are stupid and your parents were stupid and your grandparents were stupid, chances are that you won't exactly be a genius. Yeah? Now, that's biological determinism, because You might still find people that, if given the proper education, they turn out completely different. But this dentist, McTeague, who has taught himself dentistry, in the end finds his downfall because, after all, he's Irish and therefore sort of subhuman. It's a rather racist ideology and definitely a classist one. Social realism finds its starkest expression certainly after the turn of the century in Upton Sinclair, and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And if you're not yet vegetarians, but you want to become vegetarians, I would recommend reading Sinclair's The Jungle. This poem is not from his book, but the scenes from the meat market, from the abattoirs of Chicago, in that book, in The Jungle, take a strong stomach to read through and imagine that people ate that and paid money for it. Oh, you wonder how they didn't all turn sick and died. Yeah, well, this fish here I wouldn't want to eat either. Cream cheese that's innocent of cream. For things, you know, are seldom what they seem. So realism also uncovers that which is not quite the real thing. In fact, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is one of the few instances in American letters where you can prove that it had a direct effect. And that effect was the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Inspection Bill of 1906, brought about by Dr. Harvey Wiley, who looks as if he could use a diet, but he read the book, investigated into the realism of it, found that it was all true, and closed down the Chicago meat markets for a while. Another naturalist that is included also in the lecture series, Jack London, whose real name was John Griffith Cheney. Call of the Wild, his probably still most famous book, which I had the honor to edit the German edition of, the current Reklam edition, Der Ruf der Wildnis. Important also because some of his stuff reads like sort of handbook material. To Build a Fire, one of his most famous stories, which shows clearly what I would call the geographical or the socio-geographical branch of naturalism. You go out there into the woods, into the wilderness, and you make one mistake and it counts double. It's your first and your last. And this guy even makes two mistakes, and the second one kills him. So, but this kind of handbook literature, handbook reading, is stuff that comes about in, for instance, those handbooks for boys, which shows that there is no intergenerational learning any longer. People are now buying these books for their kids because they don't have anything they could teach them themselves. We'll hear more about that from John Adams in January. And now I have to really speed up. I notice I tarried a bit. Crane's Maggie. That's one of those books. He does not write wild animal stories, but he writes parodies. He writes pastiche. This is a text where you're not quite sure, am I reading a temperance tract showing these people and what alcohol did to them, or is this a story of a girl that tries, she doesn't even make much of an attempt to rise out of that squalor. In fact, she's mostly being bounced back and forth between the people that she has to live with, and in the end, she dies. So this is a typical sob story also. But as I said, it's sort of riding this edge between social realism and temperance tract romanticism. And when you're reading it with that in mind, you find it's actually quite a good read, quite an interesting book to read. By the way, if you find a copy like this that says Johnston Smith on it somewhere on a flea market or so, please, can I have it? this here, this assortment with the book, a signed first edition, and a photograph of Crane with some of his buddies. Yes, that is a skeleton sitting there next to Stephen Crane. These other guys were students of medicine. This assembly went for $17,000 back in 1993. I have no idea what this was fetched today, but these are the two books I don't actually own myself, Maggie and The Red Badge of Courage. I can't afford. We'll hear more about both of them from Philipp Steinhauser from the University of Basel, also in January. I do have a copy of The Little Regiment, and if I'd been intelligent enough, I would have brought that. Today I didn't. So if you come Monday maybe I'll bring it along to, what's the name of the place, Badenweiler. Crane, war stories sold at the time. So he wrote war stories for a while. And then they sent him, because he was such a good war writer, though he had never seen one, and he himself claimed that he'd learned about war on the football field, they sent him to Cuba to report on the insurrection there. He went on a boat, which was possibly the one on the bottom left. On the bottom right, double meaning intended, that's what you find of that boat today, because it went down with him on it. And for the next 2 days and nights, he rode and tried to save his life, which turned into one of the best short stories ever. And I just said the best short stories ever. Yes, and I mean it. It's called The Open Boat. And that's absolutely amazing and no holds barred. And again, it's something experimental, because I think what Crane tried to do was write from a third-person perspective, yes, but third-person plural, as in the perspective of several people together. Not something that apparently made it, if you think, well, do I know a lot of stories that have third-person plural perspective? No, you won't find them. But that's what happens in this period. You know, that's this experimental modernism. What can we do with literature that has not been done before? Absolutely amazing story. His reports from the Greco-Turkish War aren't really worth a lot, but it's the first war he actually sees, and where he is on the outskirts of battle. And he writes a very boring adventure novel about that, called Active Service. And I think it was intentional that he wrote a boring story about it. Unfortunately, boring stories don't sell. You'll hear more about that from me and from Ece Ergin when we talk about Crane's Europe and Orient later on this semester. Crane is also a correspondent in the Spanish-American War. And does anybody recognize the guy in the centerpiece next to the steam boiler and underneath the American flag? Er sieht aus wie Günther Häfel, das ist er aber nicht. That's the guy who later became president of the United States after having been vice president when the president got shot. That's Theodore Roosevelt, here as the colonel of the so-called Rough Riders, the first U.S. volunteers. We'll hear more about Crane and the wars from Anouk Erni, that's the one on the right, and Elisabeth Piller from the universities in Basel and the history department here, respectively. I'm close to the end, thanks for lasting. Crane's last years are spent in England, in a place in Surrey, which looks fabulous. It's one of those old country manors. Unfortunately, at that time, before climate change, southern England was wet. Rainy and wet and cold, and you could hardly heat the damn place, and he was already suffering very badly from tuberculosis, which didn't keep him from throwing a huge party on New Year's Eve 1899, and attendance at that party, this picture was actually taken at the party. This is Henry James eating donuts that Cora Crane made in their kitchen in Breed Place. And these are several of the most popular writers of the period, including H.G. Wells of Time Machine fame. And at that New Year's Eve party, he had a bad hemorrhage, spitting blood, and another one later on in the spring. So in his last weeks, they shipped him to Badenweiler, where they had a local wizard. That's the man top left, Albert Fraenkel, after whom the most well-endowed and most esteemed prize in pneumology is still named to this day, Albert Fraenkel Prize, who had cured himself from tuberculosis. There were cures, yes, some of which were pretty tough, like the so-called Nordrach treatment. And I thought that was something Scandinavian until I realized Nordrach is somewhere outside of Offenburg. But that treatment killed about as many people as it cured. So Fraenkel modified that, and they brought Crane there. 4 years later, they brought Anton Chekhov, who is a bit more popular than Crane is, and more well-known. He died there too. So they call their literary museum the Chekhov Salon rather than the Crane Salon. Anyway, that's where he went, that's where he died, and the last we see of him is this little note here from a newspaper about the late Mr. Crane. Freiburg, Crane touched only as an already dead body when he was embalmed here and then shipped back in a box to New Jersey. And with that, my introduction to the lecture series ends. Thank you all for listening and watching, and I hope I'll see you all again next week, and some of you maybe on Monday in Badenweiler for the 150th anniversary birthday party. Thank you.